Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Pennsylvania Lake Erie Environmental Forum, focused today on electricity and industry. My name is Amber Stowell, and I'm a coastal outreach specialist with Pennsylvania Sea Grant. And we're happy to be bringing this forum to you today. We have a wonderful lineup of presenters for you. As always, please be sure to stay muted with your cameras off. And if you do have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat or the Q&A box. We will be monitoring that throughout the event. So I'll turn things over to Tim to kick us off.
Great. Thank you, Amber, and good afternoon, everyone. I join Amber in welcoming you to the February 2025 meeting of the Pennsylvania Lake Erie Environmental Forum, also known as Pennsylvania LEAF. My name is Tim Bruno, and I serve as the Great Lakes Program Coordinator for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. For those of you that are new to the LEAF, this forum hosts informational sessions that allow participants to gain a deeper knowledge and appreciation of the environmental issues that affect our Great Lakes. Whether we meet virtually or in person, participants are able to engage with scientists, policy experts, and environmental professionals from here in Pennsylvania and across the Great Lakes Basin. It's a way to foster those connections to the largest freshwater system on Earth that we share with others across the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River. I encourage you to visit the Pennsylvania LEAF website regularly, as the content is updated shortly after every event. The layout allows you to easily access information about previous meetings and watch those meetings that have been recorded. I'll provide a few Great Lakes updates for today, but I'm open to any questions or conversation after today's meeting by contacting me at tibruno@pa.gov or at 717-798-6001. And I'll start my updates off with the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River Basin Water Resources Compact and Agreement. And the Compact Council and regional body are the interstate compact agency and international body charged with oversight of water use, water diversions, and conservation and efficiency on the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River. These entities are scheduled to meet on June 17th and 18th, 2025 in Chicago, Illinois. More information about how you can participate virtually will be made available online in coming months. The Compact Science team met on January 30th, 2025 to receive presentations from the USGS on recently released National Water Availability Assessment and from NOAA on the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab's recent activities. You may view this presentation at the link that I'll provide in the chat, and it has lots of good information. As per the requirements of the Compact and Agreement, Pennsylvania completed an every 5-year review of its Great Lakes water management and water conservation and efficiency program and compiled a report that went through public review. This report was submitted in December 2024 to the Compact Secretariat for review by other states and provinces for consideration of a declaration of findings that our program meets all of those responsibilities that are inside the Compact and Agreement, and we hope to all adopt that declaration of finding in late 2025. As for the Great Lakes Water Equality Agreement, this is the agreement between the U.S. and Canada that has been improving and protecting our water quality of the Great Lakes since 1972. LEAF participants can learn more about all of the activities that are inside of the agreement at www.binational.net. Of particular interest, the Annex 4 Subcommittee, which is commonly referred to as the Nutrient Subcommittee, will soon be assembling the 2024 water year Lake Erie point and non-point source phosphorus discharge data for each of the states in the province of Ontario. Pennsylvania will be participating in this process in March and April of 2025. A summary of previous reporting can be viewed on the Great Lakes Commission's Erie Stat webpage at the link that we'll be providing in the chat. The Annex 4 Subcommittee met recently at the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research at the University of Windsor, Ontario, December 3rd and 4th. Topics included binational priorities for science and action, adaptive management work plans, the status of Lake Erie priority phosphorus tributary loads, and the implementation of state and federal domestic action plans for the reduction of phosphorus on Lake Erie. The U.S. and Canadian domestic action plans for phosphorus reduction are currently being reviewed and will be updated for review later this year. The Great Lakes Executive Committee of the Water Quality Agreement met in December also. to review the progress that U.S. and Canada have made towards the goals of the Water Quality Agreement. The next GLEC committee meeting will occur in U.S. on June 10th and 11th of 2025 at a city to be determined, and details can be found on www.binational.net. There will be a way to virtually view that meeting. Finally, some great news from the DEP Great Lakes Program and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative Program that, as I mentioned during our last meeting, that DEP is successful in creating 2 additional staff positions to provide essential Great Lakes policy and grant services to both DEP and the Great Lakes Program. They have their offices in the Tom Ridge Environmental Center, and they're joining us today virtually. The first position is staffed by Susanna Harris, and she serves as the GLRI Policy and Programs Coordinator that will focus on participation in numerous science and policy work groups across the federal, state, and interstate entities on the Great Lakes. She'll be diving into areas such as phosphorus reduction, climate resiliency, all sorts of things, including invasive species. And so she's looking forward to getting started with her work. The second position is staffed by Matthew O'Donish, and he serves as the GLRI Projects and Partners Coordinator that will be responsible for administering GLRI funding agreements, sub-agreements, and contracts, and understanding the on-the-ground environmental and resource needs in the Pennsylvania Great Lakes Basin. He'll be cultivating local and regional partnerships. So if you're a partner in this region, I think you should reach out to Matt and introduce yourself. He'll be trying to understand, the on-the-ground environmental and resource needs through applying and helping others apply for Great Lakes federal funding opportunities, as well as coordinating those opportunities with state funding programs. So with that, I'm excited for today's learning opportunity, specifically on data centers, also learning about how solar power generation here inside of the basin, will have its effects, both for our resilience on our energy grids, as well as for providing that sustainable alternative options. Specifically on data centers, this is something that has been coming up as of late, as they've been created to try to fill those needs that we have for artificial intelligence and information technology, and those servers that are associated with that. And while those help all of those things that we currently need out of that sector, they also have potential impacts on our water resources, from water use to water quality, to their energy demands and electricity demands. And so we're going to have a great presentation today on that, and also looking at how solar power generation, they might interact with our environment in the Great Lakes. And so I'll turn it back now to Amber Stillwell to introduce our first speakers for today.
Thanks, Tim. I'm really happy to introduce Daryl, Rawa, and Rich. They will be presenting AI, data centers, and their water impact. As the use of online services and generative AI tools such as ChatGPT and Copilot have surged, so has the expansion of the data centers that power these tools. This has intensified attention to and concern over the environmental impact of these data centers, including their energy and water use. Data centers use immense amounts of water resources to cool their servers. In addition, power stations need water to address the increased power consumption. For example, the amount of water consumed by Virginia's Data Center Alley has grown by nearly 2/3 since 2019. In this talk, experts from Accenture, a leading technology and sustainability consulting firm, will provide an introduction to how data centers use water, share their experience with the water and environmental impact of data and AI centers, and discuss ways to mitigate that impact. So with that, Rich, Rawa, and Daryl, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Amber and to Tim for this opportunity to present to the Lake Erie Environmental Forum. It's really great to see people who have an interest in the environment and in water use. For those of you who don't know Accenture, we are the world's largest professional services firms with strong capabilities in technology, including cloud computing and AI. But we're also one of the world's leading sustainability and environmental services consulting firms. We've got over 1,200 sustainability experts globally, and we've delivered sustainability projects across 200 public and private and public sector clients in the last decade. I'm Daryl Sung. I am Accenture's Public Service Sustainability Lead, and very much excited to share with you what we've learned in our experience working on sustainability with both public sector as well as private sector clients across the country. I'll let my fellow panelists also from Accenture introduce themselves. Let's start with Rawa.
Hi, very happy to be here today. Rawa Milner. I sit within the Accenture sustainability practice. I just recently did the transition into data and AI as an AI enterprise strategist. I got 3 years with Accenture, 21 years of experience managing and developing corporate sustainability strategies, and water management has been always a constant throughout my career. Just last year, I spent 3 months on a construction site for one of these mega high-tech capital projects. Very happy to be here to explore with you what's going on with water and digital transformation and water consumption.
Rich.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rich. It's a pleasure to be here today. My background is in hydrogeology, which is hydraulics and geology, or the flow of water through subsurface media. Within that realm, I've worked broadly within water management over the last decade, built models to predict where wells will go dry during drought and periods of unsustainable groundwater management, co-wrote 6 groundwater sustainability plans in California for sustainable groundwater management planning, and have worked with surface water and groundwater managers in irrigated agricultural basins for conservation and beneficial use of water just around the country. So very excited to be here today to talk through some data center and water considerations. Great Lakes region is not California. It's very different. You have a whole different set of issues, but we're all still working within very regulated constructs that don't adapt very quickly to change. And we have a lot of change coming down the pipe with energy demand, the water use for that energy demand. And so be interesting to share some thoughts and have some discussion. So thanks. I'll turn it back to Daryl.
Thanks, Rich. Today, we are planning to do about half an hour to go over data centers and water usage. What we're really doing here is data centers and water usage 101. We've heard a lot about how I'm sure you've all read a lot about how every ChatGPT query uses a bottle of water and so on. And here what we're aiming to do is present you with the facts around data centers and water usage. Rawa will then talk about the growing demand for water in hyperscale data centers, and then we'll talk about challenge and opportunities. Following our talk, we have about half an hour for Q&A, and we are very much welcome your questions. So think of the questions as you go along, and we will take them at the end of our presentation. On to data centers and water usage. As Tim and Amber have both mentioned, we're living in a world of rapid digital transformation. We're all sitting here having a Zoom call, being able and streaming lots of video in the process. At least all of you are streaming videos of me, and right now, and we've got lots of demand for digital service like streaming video, Netflix, and so on. We've got a lot of demand from AI, which is very computing intensive. We've got that has with ChatGPT, Gemini, whichever large language model, generative AI model you want to use, all of that is very energy and water and computing intensive, which in turn means energy and water intensive. We've at the same time, we're also using a lot of data for cloud computing. And so As a result, hyperscale data centers spanning millions of square feet are emerging as crucial infrastructure for handling that massive data processing needs. And globally, we're seeing projections that suggest a significant rise in hyperscale facilities. We're expected to reach over 1,200 hyperscale facilities by 2026. And as the data center footprints grow, so does the environmental impact. And that includes using water consumption for cooling, even in water-stressed regions. Now, actually the term data centers encompasses a lot of different kinds of data centers. We've got edge data centers, smaller, decentralized ones that are in close proximity to where data is being used. We've got co-located types of data centers, which have multiple tenants housing data offsites. We've got enterprise data centers that are specific to one single entity. And we've got what's really driving a lot of the rise in demand, hyperscale data centers. They take up 20 plus megawatts power, and they're large and centralized, used by cloud providers and operated by one entity. And as I mentioned, you probably have seen all these different estimates of how much water ChatGPT query uses and so on. So I thought it would be useful to see an illustrative water impact. For a 1 megawatt each type of data center, what's the annual water consumption? That's about 6.7 million gallons. That's about the annual water consumption of about 225 Americans. For a hyperscaler, that's 200 million. We estimate about water consumption of about 200 million gallons, and the water is really mostly used for cooling. And put that in perspective, that's the annual water consumption of 6,700 Americans. Now, that is a lot, but it may not be as alarming as you might have heard in other media. To put it in another perspective, 200 million gallons is about the annual consumption of a golf course, which may be more of a comment on how water-intensive golf courses are rather than how water-efficient data centers are. But regardless, say the water use is significant, and it's growing because the use of hyperscalers are growing. But we should not be overly alarmed. We should stick with the facts. It does take up a lot of water, and here my colleagues would then talk about what can be done. But first, I should note that you can also talk about data centers not just based on their size, but based on the primary tasks they perform. And depending on what the data centers are used for, they can become more or less resource intensive. The really resource intensive types of data centers are training, inference, and high performance computing data centers. The ones that are used for scientific research, for training of machine language learning models and large language learning models. Those are very resource intensive. They're marked by the high resource marker on this slide. On the other end of the spectrum are the edge computing type data centers, smaller, decentralized. They're less intensive, but there are a lot of them. So each of them doesn't use up a lot of water, but on aggregate, they use quite a lot of water. And then somewhere in the middle are the more general purpose types of data centers, co-located data centers, general purpose ones, storage and transactional ones. Those have moderate resource needs, different balances of how much energy versus water they need, but you see there's a whole spectrum of different data centers. But for today, we're going to talk about the growing demand for water in hyperscale data centers, and also how does a data center use water? And for that, I will hand over to my colleague, Rawa.
Thank you, Daryl. Really exciting time in terms of the digital revolution today, and hyperscale data centers represent a significant evolution in digital infrastructure, supporting a vast amount of data processing and storage, which are essential for today's digital economy. The first slide we're going to present here is the map that highlights the proliferation of data centers across the United States. And if we look, there is actually a notable concentrations in key technological and commercial hubs. The forecasted growth is, of course, underpinned by increasing demands for cloud services and enhanced computing capabilities. However, this expansion brings a parallel increase in resource consumption, particularly water for cooling processes. This would actually impose sustainability challenges, especially in water-stressed regions. And looking at these maps, we will figure that nearly 40% of data centers are expected to be concentrated in regions and areas known for water stress by 2027. We can see a notable cluster around the Great Lake due to the availability of cooler climates and ample water resources. If we look how data centers are expanding, the interest is not only in availability of water resources, but also the cooler climate is one of the criteria for going for site location. However, these concentration necessitates proactive strategies to prevent strain on these critical resources. And as regulatory bodies, I'm sure top of mind is ensuring that these developments do not compromise water quality and availability for other essential uses. Moving to the next slide, please, Daryl. Water. So speaking of the water, understanding water footprint in data centers. So moving to the next slide, please, Daryl. Water footprint considerations are becoming as critical as carbon footprints. We hear a lot of discussion about like reduction of carbon emission. Actually, the slide before there, we're talking about the intake, the footprint. In evaluating, so the water footprinting again has become as a critical, is an essential criteria as carbon footprint in evaluating data centers sustainability. This diagram provides an overview of typical water usage in data centers. If we look at the cycle from intake to treatment and reuse, it's important to understand this cycle. This is essential for developing strategies that not only reduce total water consumption, but also enhance recycling and reuse of water, therefore minimizing environmental impact. So if we break down this cycle very quickly, water and energy interlinkages. Looking at how the water and energy play together and interconnected in data centers are actually very energy and water intensive developments. They consume both water and energy in substantial amounts. Cooling systems account for a significant part of this water usage, while powering the servers and infrastructure drives energy consumption. Interdependency with water and energy means that improvement in one area can often impact the other. But also, as regulatory body, it means that there is a complexity in how we will tailor regulatory measures as they need to address both elements together. Cooling needs is the largest share of water in data centers and is used in cooling. There are various cooling techniques employed, including evaporative cooling, liquid cooling, and newer methods like direct-to-chip cooling. We'll go over it all in the next part of the presentation. Each cooling type has a different water footprint, and the choice of technology can greatly affect the overall water demand of a facility. Some data centers utilize on-site water systems, others draw from external sources. This choice also impacts the local water supply and environmental footprint. On-site recycling systems such as closed-loop cooling can definitely reduce external water dependency while offering at the same time more sustainable approach. Discharge and water quality is a very important aspect of this water cycle. After water is used in cooling, it's often treated and discharged back into the environment. This discharge may contain chemicals or minerals from cooling processes. This might raise concerns about water quality and environmental impact. So moving forward, setting guidelines for water quality post-discharge from data centers will be critical to prevent local ecosystem destruction. Moving to the next slide, different moving to the next, okay. Different regions offer diverse challenges and opportunities for water sourcing in data centers. So if we start with water intake, the first stage in the data center water cycle, data centers source water primarily from municipal and regional utilities. In some regions where freshwater resources are under pressure, they may turn to alternative sources like reclaimed water or even seawater, though this requires more complex treatment. Data centers also adapt their water intake based on regional conditions. For example, in areas with higher water scarcity, data centers might use non-potable water for certain operations or adjust their intake patterns to lessen the impact on local communities. Regional adaptations are critical for ensuring that data centers can meet their operational needs while respecting local water constraints and community needs. Again, regional water stress and legal framework. Obviously, the Great Lakes is not really an area with high water stress, but also the circumstances around the water cycle in the data centers will imply that there will be some regulatory and will necessitate that there will be water intake strategies and robust conservation and reuse practices. Moving to the next slide, which is really very technical around the different cooling technologies. We believe this understanding is very, very important as the Great Lake River look into data centers, whether from regulatory and licensing perspective, but also to understand the ramifications of each choice of technologies these data centers are going to go for. So once water is brought into the data center, again, the primary role and where water is consumed is in cooling the IT equipment. So IT equipment generates intense heat. Water is used for cooling. The next step in water cycle is to understand what are the methods and technologies that manage this process. So first, we have evaporative cooling. This one is more traditional method. Water is used to absorb heat from data center. As the water evaporates, it removes heat. Very traditional as a cooling for data centers. This method is effective. However, the process has a significant drawback, which is basically high water consumption. A substantial amount of water is lost through evaporation, which can be problematic, especially in water-stressed regions. So while this is effective cooling mechanism, it's not always the most sustainable choice. That's why this method has been always the point of focus in regions where regulatory bodies are concerned about water scarcity. Next, we have liquid immersion cooling. This method represents a more advanced and water-efficient approach. In this system, servers are submerged in thermally conductive, non-conductive liquid that directly absorb the heat generated by the equipment. Unlike, in contrast to the evaporative cooling, liquid immersion does not rely on air conditioning or extensive water evaporation. So that in total, the whole process lead to impressive reductions in water use, up to 91% less, in fact, less water consumption. Additionally, it can lower energy consumption as the liquid more efficiently transfers heat away from hardware compared to traditional air cooling. This technology is especially valuable in hyperscale data centers looking for to minimize their water and energy footprints. Another innovative approach is direct-to-chip cooling. This technology actually has been the interest of multinational water companies. As Accenture, we were actually providing support to one of these companies in exploring the growth in this technology and the growth the forecast for the growth in this technology is really impressive. Direct-to-chip cooling focuses on cooling at the source, so the chip itself. In this method, dielectric coolant is circulated directly across the chip on processors, therefore absorbing heat before it dissipates into the environment. This technology, this type of cooling provides several benefits. It improves significantly the cooling efficiencies, reduces water usage. More importantly, it enhances the overall energy efficiency of the facility. This method can lower water energy demands by up to 50%, making it one of the most promising cooling solutions for sustainable data centers. Regulators and operators see this as a strategic solution for reducing environmental impact in areas with high data centers density. Lastly, AI-driven cooling management. So this particular technology and approach is actually evident that technology is actually the trigger of some sustainability problems and challenges, but technology is also a solution for these sustainability challenges. This method does not refer to a specific physical cooling system, but rather it's an intelligent approach to optimizing cooling using real-time data. AI systems monitor the temperature and heat distribution within the facility and make dynamic adjustment to maintain optimal cooling. This might include selectively activating or deactivating processors, managing workload, or adjusting cooling based on forecasted temperature. Again, the goal here is to ensure that cooling resources are used as efficiently as possible, therefore minimizing water and energy use while maintaining performance. AI-driven cooling is a perfect example on how data centers can leverage technology to align operational efficiency with sustainability. We can see applications in Intel actually was using this, deploying this approach extensively, and they successfully reduced with a mixture of the previous cooling technology. Then they were able to reduce their energy and water consumption significantly. If we move to the second slide, very quickly. So what happens to water post-cooling phase? It follows three primary pathways: recirculation, discharge, or evaporation. The first and most sustainable pathway, naturally, is recirculation. In this process, water is reused within the cooling system rather than being discarded. However, recirculated water often needs to be cooled down before it can be used again, because reusing overly heated water can compromise system efficiency. This approach embodies the concept of water circularity. The objective is to minimize waste and maximize reuse. It is most environmentally friendly option, and when implemented effectively can reduce data centers' total water demand by as much as 50%. Again, it's very effective, but it requires robust filtration and cooling infrastructure to maintain water quality and temperature. The second pathway is discharge. In some cases, water used for cooling accumulates minerals, chemicals, or particulate matter. So it makes it unsuitable for further use without significant treatment. When this happens, data centers may discharge this water to wastewater treatment plants. Regulatory oversights have been so far essential to prevent any disruption in local ecosystems. Discharge water must meet environmental standards to avoid harming local water resources. At the moment, approximately 40% of the water used in data centers is discharged. While it's discharged, it's like often under strict regulatory guidelines to ensure that it does not negatively impact communities and ecosystems. Finally, we have evaporation, which is the most water-intensive process of the three. Evaporation occurs when water is used in open cooling system where heat causes it to vaporize, effectively lowering the temperature, but resulting in water loss. This is especially common in evaporative cooling systems, which are efficient in removing heat that lead to significant water consumptions. Reports indicate that about 60% of the water used in data centers end up evaporating, which is really a significant amount of water. For data centers, especially those in water-scarce regions, the high rate of evaporation raises concerns about sustainability and, of course, the need for these data centers to consider alternative cooling methods. Evaporation means that water must be continually replenished, typically from local fresh rainwater sources, which obviously we need to be more innovative to try to avoid because it obviously put additional strain on regional water supplies. So just a quick summary, the fate of cooling water in data centers has critical implications for the water sustainability. Circulation is ideal pathway. However, it requires sophisticated infrastructure. Discharge needs regulatory scrutiny. And evaporation remains a challenge, especially in region of having going through like conditions of water scarcity. Moving to the last slide. So we mentioned that there is this interdependency between water and energy, both data centers being water and energy intensive infrastructure. As we consider the environmental footprint for these data centers, it's very important that we understand the matrix that guide their water and energy usage. Two primary matrices are widely used: the water use effectiveness and energy usage effectiveness. I have to be like open about our observation that to this date, although we say that they are interdependent and both are important, what we observed is that the main focus on data centers today is energy usage effectiveness. We all heard the crisis about water energy. Water is still like somewhat, for reasons I personally do not understand, invisible, although we all obviously are struggling with it. So if we look at the water usage effectiveness, the water use effectiveness basically measures water used per unit of IT energy consumption. So it provides insight into how water efficient the data center is. So what that means is the lower water usage efficiency, the better the water efficiency is. However, there is a critical trade-off here. So achieving low water use effectiveness, can sometimes require higher energy use. So for instance, systems that reduce water use by relying on air cooling can demand more electricity, which again create an operational balance between water conservation and energy efficiency. On the other hand, the energy usage effectiveness measures the total energy consumed for every unit used by IT equipment alone. So optimizing the energy usage effectiveness often emphasizes reducing energy waste, sometimes even at the cost of higher water consumption, unfortunately. This is particularly relevant in water-abundant areas where energy conservation might be prioritized over water saving. In practice, data centers need to balance between the two matrices. But we need to understand that it's a nuanced approach. Operators always have to choose between these metrics based on regional constraints and environmental goals. For example, in regions with severe water scarcity, data centers may opt for higher energy use effectiveness solution if it means conserving water. Conversely, in areas with ample water supply but limited energy sources, optimizing energy use effectiveness may take precedence. So by this, I think we move to the next section of our presentation, which Rich is going to take over to explain the challenges and opportunities for data centers and water management. Rich?
Awesome. Thanks, Rawa. Yeah, so that's all really great context. Let's try to bring it together and then we'll open it up for Q&A and some discussion. But just to highlight a few challenges and opportunities, two big buckets, environmental and social challenges, and then responsible water use adoption challenges. So when you're thinking about your ESG bucket, we have communities and we have agricultural and the environment. And so when strategically siting new data centers, the local water availability should be taken into consideration and where that water is coming from. So just to give you a concrete example, if the water is diverted, what are the impacts on the ecosystems and agriculture, and what's that mass balance, water balance perspective for that region in place? Same goes for any discharge and recycling. You know, what are the point source temperature considerations and discharges that are going into waterways, and what sort of water quality considerations are there? It's an old adage that you can't manage what you can't measure. And so what are the policies and programs that we have in place or that we need to put in place in order to capture that information, have visibility into the impact of data centers on communities and agriculture and in the environment? You know, also want to highlight agriculture and the environment. So from a mass balance perspective, you know, water used in one place is going to take away from water used in another place. Although, you know, the actual volumes of water, I dropped it in the chat, are not extremely, you know, they're not in the thousands of acre foot range per data center. But when you start getting many data centers in one area, that can start to add up. So it's just a, you know, matter of kind of adding up the numbers, getting the rough orders of magnitude and kind of looking at it and seeing if that'll have a material effect on that local community and agriculture and ecosystem. And every place is going to be different, right? You all will sort of know the ins and outs of your specific regions better than we will, for instance. So those are your some ESG challenges. For responsible water use adoption challenges, data transparency, I'd already mentioned this, but you know, businesses don't always have these systems in place or capture these numbers. I know, for instance, that Google does a really good job of reporting water use efficiency, or sorry, not water, sorry, power use efficiency, what Rob covered on the last slide. And they do have some like net zero water goals and will report water use. So I think like having those conversations, and when you do have time to connect with any data centers, right, sort of bringing some of these things up around like, where's the reporting, where's the data, so that we can understand impacts on our ecosystems is going to be important. It's also just challenging to collect that data, coordinate with people, and you know, there's a human dimension to this problem that makes it difficult to practically implement, right? Yeah, this type of monitoring may not be present in business cases that data centers are putting together when they're standing up a new site. So those are some of the challenges. Let's go to the next slide. We'll talk about a few of the opportunities. So, you know, we again have these bucketed into two categories. On the right, we've got water optimization, and on the left, water replenishment. So, you know, Rob covered a lot of these, but closed loop systems offer a lot of potential savings just in terms of using your water more efficiently. using liquid cooling as opposed to evaporative cooling is advantageous from a water conservation perspective. And just having smart water management systems and reducing or just like increasing efficiency in monitoring that water and using it can lead to reductions in daily water consumption. And we have a few numbers here just drawn from leaders in industry and sort of what we can expect when employing these technologies. So that's water optimization. In terms of replenishment, we have conservation, recharging if there's a, agricultural groundwater area or interconnected surface water where recharging has some specific benefits, or in some cases we've seen areas use excess water for golf courses or for other, beneficial uses of that water. But it all comes back to treatment, right? Like, what's the level of treatment? What's the quality of the water coming off of the data centers, and can it be used for other beneficial uses? The requirements for a golf course are going to be very different than those for agriculture, right? So the one example I was thinking of in particular was a Superfund site, actually, where the treated water was, re-injected through a series of barrier wells into a golf course. So it served that additional use. But ultimately, and this is kind of my closing thought, you've got to monitor the ins and outs. You can only manage what you can measure. So for all those diversions or consumption, do we have a handle on those, and can we coordinate the acquisition of those numbers? And then on the discharge recycling front, what's the level of efficiency? What's the temperature? What's the quality? What are the point source injections that are going into waterways? And do we have a handle on that? You can be advocates and champions for advanced treatment systems, closed loop systems, efficient systems. And I think one final word of caution I would put out is, for data centers that are reliant on municipal water, and that, if the data centers require sufficient water that requires upgrades to a system, where you actually have to, there's a capitally intensive project, you have to build new infrastructure. How is that cost realized? How is that project financed? Right? Does it fall on the community and the rate base? Are there any like social considerations to make there in terms of who is impacted? And how are data centers themselves securing and financing some of that, or basically how are the costs distributed, right? And so that there are kind of pros and cons of, different approaches to financing the water infrastructure to support data centers. But some things that you can read about further to see what the industry is already doing revolve around how power plants are securing power right now, right? So, or data centers rather are securing power. So some of the large tech companies, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, right? We're seeing them go into existing, like build out and finance the production of energy prior to building that data center. And so we could think of a similar type of financing for water infrastructure if it was required in a region. And again, it's going to depend on the size of the municipal water centers, what the regional water budget is, if it's being satisfied via municipal use versus diversion. But just another thing to highlight. So that's all I have right now. I think I will turn it back over to Daryl, I believe. And I think our next slide is just some free time, the chat.
Yes. We hope you've enjoyed our presentation, and we hope you've got questions, and we're ready to take your questions now. Amber, how does this work? Are they able to come on camera, or do we put the questions in the chat?
They can put their questions in the chat or the Q&A, and I see some in the chat and the Q&A already. You've already answered this, but maybe elaborate a little bit more on what happens to the water after it gets used.
I can answer to the public policy interventions. if we look, so in the United States, there's always this like good maneuver between these technology companies and policymakers, but I think the case to be made here is in the EU. EU countries have been able so far to go for more stringent water resources. They're focused on building a resource effective or resource efficient economy. And so they're encouraging investments. And the policy discussion is very important one, because we need to be innovative in policy and not make it only based on negative incentives. I think the success in Europe with like limited also success in China is also based on the positive incentive that they've been providing. So if you look at not only regulating data centers per se, but having like a nationwide water circularity strategy that can provide incentives, whether it was a green fund, tax credits, where you can provide incentives for these companies to actually become part of water circularity. Let's put it as water circularity. In the United States, it's been always the prompted by, okay, there is a water scarcity, and there's like this urge to always innovate the next big thing. So we always continue to innovate. So policy again is a way to restructure the market, where those who want to do the right things are not penalized, but actually everyone has to be subject to the same regulation, and we have to be bold in how we regulate water, but also provide both negative and positive incentives for these businesses to pursue economic development agenda. Obviously, the digital growth is very important for our national economy and national security, but we need to do it using both arms, positive and negative policy tools.
I'll go in order. There's questions both in the chat and the Q&A, so I'll go in the order that they were entered. So the next question is from Thomas Meyer and says, evaporated water just returns to the water cycle. So where is the waste? I think that's a Rawa or Rich question.
Well, if you look at it from a watershed perspective, you may think this way, but unfortunately, water doesn't always come back to the most scarce areas. I think Rich can also contribute to the answer of this question. I wish it was like evaporated and it will come back. From a watershed perspective, yes, you're right. But from localized water scarcity conditions, it doesn't always come back to where it has to come back. That's the only thing.
Yeah, I think the extreme example I like to give is in the case of a very agriculturally intensive groundwater basin, where water is pumped out, applied to the crops, and approximately 60 to 80% can leave via evapotranspiration. We still see groundwater table declines there, right? Because the water that's evapotranspirated that enters the air just moves somewhere else. So like around the region or the globe, right, there's a mass balance of water, but its distribution is still changed. And I think, water centers are part of that, right? They're affecting the water cycle in a novel way.
And also, just very important note about groundwater. If we're drafting groundwater is very unique in the sense that it's ancient. It takes 100 years, 200 years, sometimes 1,000 years for one watershed, like the groundwater, to be replenished under the ground, in a watershed. So the hydrology is complicated, especially around groundwater. It's just evaporation does not really replenish the loss that happens in groundwater.
The next question we have, actually no, first is a technical question, but I think, and Tim is answering it, but Alana asked whether we are recording this. The next question we have is, do we know how data centers may impact local water cycles in the Great Lakes region? And that's from Nora Grass, especially with the possibility of rainwater harvesting and water reuse closed loop systems. How might we expect groundwater recharge and local wetlands ecosystems to change because of data center water demands? So I think that builds on the groundwater reference earlier.
I can just Rich, you can chime in. My thing is the importance of this forum today is to basically go into data centers in the Great Lakes fully cognizant of like these are the pros and cons, these are the technology solutions. So it's really about like envisage like the vision into what does it take for us to build a data center on the Great Lakes? What should we be careful about? What should we regulate? What should we provide incentive to happen? And I want us, like, now that someone asked this question, I just want to highlight that I'm sure all of you heard Amazon, Meta, Google, they all signed these, I don't know how many, the dollar figure to deploy smaller modular reactors. This is something also to take note of. We're working in Accenture on sort of a point of view around the downsides, because the obsession, again, for reasons that I personally cannot understand yet, there's a lot of visibility around energy, because if you have energy, you have data center. If you don't have energy, you don't have data center, but they're fine with water because it's an invisible, like they can't take it out of the groundwater, even if they have overdrafted the groundwater. But that's beside the point. I think the focus on energy, their laser focused on energy, because the amount of energy required to run all of these data centers is astronomical. And so deployment of smaller modular reactors should really be at the attention now of Great Lakes policymakers and regulators, not because it's a bad thing, but because there are certain things that we need to pay attention that are different to your typical technology deployed in the data center. So water, these reactors is water intensive. It's actually even more than the normal cooling system within the data centers. But also there are critical trade-offs that they have to be paid attention to when you roll out these modular reactors. So it's less carbon intensive, but it's more water intensive, and you have water contamination and health and safety component that is not typically present in other data centers. I don't know if I answered the question. Please chime in, Rich and Daryl.
Yeah, Nora, just like direct answer to your question, I think you just need to count it. So what's the demand? Where will they be sited? What's a reasonable projection per year that we'll see? And what's the consumptive demand? And then how will we satisfy that demand? Will it come from surface water? Will it come from groundwater? Where are those municipal systems? If you're making diversions away from streams, that could impact ecosystems, but it depends the amount of diversion. And so I think, without being an expert per se in Great Lakes hydrology and water management, we'd have to have conversations around what the consumptive demand would look like at different time horizons and how that would impact regionally and then like local areas. And like most things, you'd probably see more of a local impact than a regional impact, because these are like very concentrated extraction points.
Last comment. Having been on the leadership of executing capital projects, I think usually before you approve a capital project, there is a water and climate vulnerability assessment. So if you look at the water vulnerability assessment, it doesn't look at the current state of like what are the water availability circumstances now, context now, but also it speaks to the growth in population, what are the economic development plans for the particular watershed or particular cluster of cities, and how this will impact water consumption, and based on it, decisions are made.
Our colleague Rich had to leave for a different meeting, but I think I can take the next question, which is from Jenny Tompkins, who's asked, what public policy interventions can be leveraged to incentivize improved water use efficiency by data centers to prevent a race to the bottom for development? Are there any policy examples on water conservation best practices that you can speak to, and what levels of government would implement it? One thing I will say is that whole area of regulating data centers, energy and water use and environmental impact is very, very new. The EU, which tends to be one of the leaders in environmental regulations, had a revised energy efficiency directive that only went into effect in 2023, and their first reporting deadline for the energy performance of data centers was in September 2024, which shows you how recent even a forward-thinking forward-thinking government thinking about water policy and energy policy has been with regards to data centers. But I think I'll speak in terms of overall water use efficiency and what kinds of public policy interventions have been successful. So what I've seen working for the government of Singapore is, which is relatively water scarce, is that one of the strongest public policy interventions is actually just water pricing. If you make water cost the actual amount that it costs to actually produce, and that includes all the treatment, that really gives a strong incentive to the users of water to use water very efficiently. And there's a sort of carrot, and it's a stick with a even bigger stick behind it, which is that if you don't respond to a market mechanism like pricing to reduce your water use, we may have to then actually the government may actually have to step in and start taking more drastic steps to restrict use. But that I think we've found that producers in other water intensive industries like the semiconductor manufacturing have responded very well to price incentives. And then there's also just very strong. It's also very important to have interagency cooperation on water use, right? Like you have both, especially in places like Arizona, where there's water scarcity, but you have Intel building facilities. You really have to think about balance. Water rights are such a tricky question in America, especially who owns the water rights. And the way water rights are treated are very different from state to state. And one of the most important things is to have that coordination between this local, state, and federal levels to make sure that water conservation is properly adhered to. Best practices are properly adhered to. Otherwise, it doesn't really work if there's a weak link in that chain. I want to make sure that we have time to answer questions. So I'm going to go to the next question, which is from James Horton. This may be how long is a piece of string kind of question, but what is the capacity of data centers to curtail their operations? If there was a drought and water supplies became limited, would it be possible for a data center to then limit their operations by, say, 25% on demand?
Good question. I honestly do not know. I can just guess that they cannot take a risk if the IT equipment are not cooled enough. Like I don't know if they can. Well, there are systems now where they can do optimization. So they run IT systems based on like availability of water. So optimization. I think that's what machine learning now and AI intelligent systems are doing. You're actually optimizing the system to run at certain capacities, at certain availability of resources, So yes, there is this optimization game going on now. And I mentioned Intel as an example. They're really good at this optimization game.
The next question is from Thomas Getting. And it says, are you looking at reusing the heat? So I guess this is more of an energy question. For instance, or heating structures in the winter or power generation or an industry that requires heating?
I heard of one circumstance, and actually I'm sure it's present in more than just one case. In France, I think they actually use this heat into like I think it was localized energy generation unit that was also adjacent to the data center. This question is very important from the perspective of where the world is going in terms of where the selection of data center sites. So if you see here in the United States, we have, I think, 32, I don't know, they call them not industrial hubs, they call them something else. But in the EU, China, and different countries, they call them industrial hubs, where you do the water, energy, resource reutilization all in one industrial hub, where you can circulate the energy, you can circulate the water, and you can also recover some of the materials, use some in one industrial process. The garbage of one industrial process is the gold for another industrial process. So this is better enabled in industrial hubs. I don't remember what's the name that in the Inflation Act we used for the 32, either science hubs or science parks, but we're going also into this direction here in the United States, which will enable more circularity, whether it was heat, materials, or water.
I think to build on that, right, data centers do generate a lot of low-grade heat energy. I think I've seen estimates as much of 98% of the electricity consumed by data centers is then discarded as low-grade heat energy. And utility consumption is one of the biggest expenses of data centers. Right? They're actually if you've ever been near a data center, they're actually relatively low in terms of staff and human resources, but these consume a lot of energy. And so there's been a lot of work put in on how do you make the energy efficient. And one of the things I've seen being worked on is combining heat pumps with data centers so that you reuse the waste heat, right? You take that low-grade, low-temperature heat and use heat pumps to convert that to convert that and to achieve extra efficiency. The next question we have is, it's not really a question, it's a comment from Jean Ganger, who says you're not talking just about the data center water usage, but the nuclear reactor water usage. Yeah, I would say generally when we think about the water usage of data centers, there is both the water. We talk specifically, and this talk has been focused on the water usage of directly for cooling the data center, but it's also an additional element, which is that power. Nuclear reactors, but also other power sources use water, and so any increase in the use of data centers also increases the secondary use of water through the use of water by their respective power sources, whether it's nuclear or whether it is or whether it's a coal-fired power plant. John Cannoli asked, how many data centers are there in the Lake Erie region and how many on drawing board? And I think that Nora Grass, thank you so much. There's a map, and that's where I would have gotten the data from. So I don't have much to add to that response. Let me just make sure that have I missed any questions? No, I think that's all the questions we have. Are there any more questions? If not, I would like to say it's been such a pleasure talking to all of you about water use and data centers, as well as energy use and data centers. It's certainly a very big environmental issue, and it's a very localized environmental issue. The way that you need to think about water use near Lake Erie and in the Great Lakes region is very different from examples in the West like California and Arizona. But at the same time, it's certainly something that's very much on environmentalists and data center operators' minds all across the country, and we very much appreciate the chance to share our thoughts on the subject with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl. And this, I think some of our attendees today are pretty astute, because I had a lot of the same questions I was going to follow up on. And one of the final questions regarding total overall water use, based upon the data processing energy needs, and also the water use that for the potential electricity that's utilized during that process, I think is a good one. And Nora Grass, she had mentioned, a website that cites that 75% of data center water use is indirect. And that can vary greatly based upon where this thing is, where any individual data center is located. When you look at the proportionality of any electrical generation inside of that geographic area of the grid. And so looking at the Great Lakes region, and it's kind of split up, right? You have like an eastern area of the Great Lakes, of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, and then it bridges into the Midwest. And there's different menus of how we generate electricity inside of there. But that being said, if you could just give a generalized outlook, we have been trying to transition in the region from coal-fired generation facilities to ones that are more sustainable, such as natural gas that don't emit as much carbon into the atmosphere overall, and other sustainable sources such as wind and solar. Knowing that and knowing that our energy requirements for these new centers are going to be off the charts. And they're looking for opportunities to generate things such as these modular reactors. Is there the possibility that we might have air quality impacts from the need for electricity and the reactivization of certain generation facilities, such as coal-fired ones?
I mean, I would say certainly. Before I was a climate, before I focused on climate change, I was focusing on air pollution, and certainly, it's really a race in speed, right? We see, as we did when the internet became big and computing, Moore's law and computing power grew, that there's always a race between how much energy you need and the race of chip manufacturers to recognizing that you need to make more efficient facilities. And right now, we're at a point where to be able to be able to meet the demand for AI and the demand for basically data centers, people have been looking at reopening facilities that we thought were shut down. Now, sometimes that means reopening nuclear facilities. We saw I think many of you would have seen the news about since we're with the Pennsylvania Forum, about 3 Mile Island and Microsoft trying to restart something at 3 Mile Island. So that nuclear is carbon free, but and has its emissions impact is relatively minor. But if people feel like you need to restart combined cycle natural gas plants or even worse, coal, in order to meet that demand, we are going to see a rise in the associated particulate matter and the associated air pollutants, all the various criteria air pollutants, SOx, NOx, mercury, ozone, whatever, all of the various discharges that we've come to associate with coal-fired power plants, as well as to a lesser degree with natural gas plants. I would say I'm not going to be able to forecast where we're going to live, and because it really is for achieve the efficiency improvements before you have to resort to reopening closed power facilities. And the operators have a very strong incentive to reduce their energy use. It's as we mentioned, it's one of the biggest cause of expenditure in their operations. And also they just want to become more efficient at doing the AI. You may have seen the news about DeepSeek and how it's actually a much more efficient generative AI engine compared to OpenAI's ChatGPT or Google's Gemini. And the race is on to try to become more efficient, to reduce and to use a lot less computing power. And it's really a question, and it's really a question of how fast that race to efficiency proceeds versus the race to meet the current demand by reopening current existing facilities or reopening closed facilities.
Well, it sounds like the race is on.
Yeah.
And everybody's trying to find that perfect balance between computing power, electrical usage, and water use. And with that, I really want to thank your entire team there for coming and presenting today. It's really been eye-opening. And in full disclosure, this is not the first time I've seen this presentation. And we had some questions here today from folks as to how are governments thinking about this across the United States, even the world. And in the Great Lakes, we have the states and the provinces that have come together to agree on how water is used, how it's conserved, and how we implement efficiency measures and how we regulate those across the entire region. And we're lucky that we have that. And hopefully with some of the information that folks like you, your team provide, we can make wise decisions amongst the entire region so that we can accommodate, growth in our society and our economy balanced with sustainable water use. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of you, and no pressure, but you guys are the custodians and stewards of one of the largest freshwater reserves in the world. So wishing you all the best of luck. We're very happy to contribute, even if a drop to your huge responsibility. Good luck with that. It's really a huge responsibility.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So with that, we'll turn it back over to Amber to introduce our next participant.
Actually, it's break time, if that's okay with
Oh,
you.
is it? Okay.
Yeah, but we can make it a shorter
lead the
break.
way.
Thank you again, Daryl, Rawa, and Rich. I know Rich had to jump off, but that was a wonderful presentation and really wonderful questions from all of you here at the forum. We will be taking a brief break between now and our next speaker. So it's 2:18 right now. Let's take a 5-minute break and everyone jump back on at around 2:23, 2:25 maybe, to make it even. How's that sound? All right, we'll see everyone back at 2:25. Hey everyone, I hope you had a nice break and got a stretch, grabbed a glass of water. We're going to dive right into our next presentation. Matt, are you ready while I read your bio?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Matthew Svets is with Penn State Extension, and he's here to talk to us about solar farms and the impacts that they have on freshwater resources in Northwest Pennsylvania. Matt is a part-time educational program specialist with Penn State Extension, and his work focuses on the physical, environmental, and economic impacts of grid-scale solar developments. So thanks, Matt, for being here today, and please take it away.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Amber. So, as you said, I'm a Penn State Extension energy educator, and I work a lot with energy in general, but specifically with impacts of solar development. Some work also with anaerobic digesters. So, with that, I think we'll start off with getting into why solar is here in PA, then kind of get into where is it actually going to be sited, does Northwest PA need to actually worry about it? And finally talk about, what we've seen as far as what impacts that solar energy might have on freshwater, primarily pretty much through runoff concerns and stormwater concerns. There we go. So kind of why we're seeing solar happen in PA. Well, one of the biggest reasons why we've seen solar come here is that improvements in efficiency of panels have kind of made solar practical here, not just in the more sunnier parts of the country. So there's generally enough sun here. One other huge factor, and we'll get into this more later, is that PA is a net energy exporter, and with that comes a lot of energy infrastructure to move electricity. And that is incredibly important for any type of energy development, including solar. There is also, as our previous guest showed, there is an increased demand for energy. A lot of that has to do with data centers. There's also increases in using electrifying certain things, as well as other industries that are onshoring here. So we've seen this increased demand for energy that, solar is one energy source that can meet it. We also see businesses interested in hitting renewable energy targets. So they're also interested in promoting and helping develop solar, as well as the government is also interested, PA government is also interested in promoting solar. And for the PA government, that is one of the biggest things is the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards Act, which has required a 0.5% carve out of solar energy to be produced. Now, that isn't too much, but the incentives that it's provided have been a fairly big factor in, um, allowing solar to develop here in PA. And then finally, on a national level, we've seen just declining cost in general and the huge cost curve that has been cut for solar, as well as incentives such as the Inflation Reduction Act, which, with the current administration is kind of in limbo for exactly what's going to happen to it. But so far, it has been instrumental in kind of driving development and making more projects feasible on that side as well. So that's kind of why we've seen solar rise, and we've kind of seen solar in PA since I'd say 2012. So still a fairly new industry, but one that is growing here in PA. Before we get into some of the stuff, I think this is important, is to talk about what this energy infrastructure actually looks like that's so important to solar and other energy sources. So generally how it works is that you usually have larger power plants. This could be solar, coal, nuclear, the like, that produce a large amount of energy. That is then kind of stepped up to a form that can move along our high voltage transmission lines that distribute that energy from these places across the state of PA to substations and transformers that step down that electricity to a form that businesses and homes can use across three-phase lines that are more meant for businesses, maybe larger farms, and then single-phase lines that are meant for homes. So I want you to keep that in mind as we get into this more, but so we kind of talked about why solar in PA, but what does this land use actually look like, and where is it actually going to be sited? So generally, the size of these projects is about 5 to 8 acres per megawatt. So for a utility scale solar site, which connects to the transmission lines, that is going to be at least 20 megawatts or 100 acres to give you an idea of size scale here. And then there is another form of solar, which is on the smaller scale, and that's net metering. I won't get into it much for this webinar, but if you want to learn more, we have other webinars on our Penn State Extension site that get a little bit more into it. But there was a Homrich court case in 2021 that allowed for this form of net metering and allowed solar companies to receive retail power rates, which are much higher than the wholesale they might otherwise receive for producing energy. And this allowed for these more net metering projects to be economically feasible and provide energy on our more distribution grid through three-phase power. And generally speaking, the size of these projects, you won't get anything more than 30, 35 acres. though there is one caveat I'll go over later. And finally, community solar, which has the question mark there because it's not yet legal in PA. There has been legislation. So if it did get approved, it would be about 0.5 to 10 megawatts, so a little bit larger than our net metering scale. But that is another consideration for the future that we might see, given that every year we see legislation put out. So also, kind of what do these projects look like? Well, you might imagine that these projects are just panels on panels, row after row in a large field, but they can also be a little bit more spread out where we have a 156 megawatt project that was proposed by Lightsource BP. I know a few parts of it have already been approved, but it is a more spread out version where instead of one field, you have it spread out into 20 to 30 megawatt chunks across 2 counties and 4 townships, about 900 to 1,000 acres of development. So that is also another thing you might want to look at if to see, what these projects actually look like. And then net metering, this is the caveat I told you about, is that how the court case was kind of how it laid it out. There is a way that they can get around this 3 megawatt smaller limit to some extent by citing 2 projects right next to each other, as long as they're separately metered and technically 2 separate projects, usually under 2 different LLCs. Then you can pretty much get up to a 6 to 9 megawatt facility through this net metering aspect. So that's one thing to note, that the 3 megawatt, it's usually projects under that 3 megawatt range, but it can exceed that. So let's talk about an important factor of where these projects are going to be sited, especially the larger scale projects, and that is through PGM and through their control of the high voltage transmission lines. They are a regional transmission operator, and they serve PA as well as the other states you see there in the picture. But they are the ones who oversee this interconnection process to the high voltage transmission and manage these projects. Now, a big thing to remember here is that without this high voltage transmission, usually within 3 miles of the high voltage transmission line, a solar project just isn't going to be economically feasible to be built no matter what. So that is probably the biggest consideration for where a solar site is going to be sited. Does it have access to that high voltage transmission, and can it get a reasonable cost for connecting to that interconnection or connecting to that high voltage transmission from PGM? Now, we have seen a pause on a lot of these large scale projects because PGM the queue that they have got inundated by so many different energy projects that they had to take a step back, rework their system, make it more efficient, and come back. And now they're finally starting to move through that queue that they had and move these larger scale projects through. And right now, I think there's 345 projects in the queue. We could see that jump once they open up the queue back to more developers. We shall see. But to give you an idea, again, as you can see here, the lines there are high voltage transmission lines. And as you can see, these proposed solar projects are going to fall pretty much within all of those lines. And you can also get a sense of where is development pressure the strongest. And to talk about Northwestern PA, as you can see here, there are a lot of proposed projects kind of up in this northwest corner. So that is certainly something to look out for. And also, with large net metering projects, this is something because of the queue pauses that existed. These projects are more ubiquitous. They can be sited anywhere 3-phase power is, which is pretty much everywhere. And these smaller projects have exploded because of the PGM queue and the favorable retail rates they can receive. So this is something that I've seen more and more. I've heard a bunch of examples here in Western PA, especially down in Mercer, where these projects are, you know, being attempted going through the permitting process. So it's definitely something where these smaller projects have gotten really popular, much more so than the utility scale projects in recent years. And finally, I talked about the importance of infrastructure access for large scale for these more distributed projects. Generally speaking, they need to be, it varies on developer to developer, but generally within a mile of three-phase power lines and a substation to be economical. And then another thing I'll get into of, well, where are these usually sited? Well, the vast majority of them are going to be sited on agricultural lands for the same reason housing development or warehouses are generally sited on agricultural lands. They have great drainage. They're relatively flat. You have a lot of space to work with, which especially utility scale solar needs. So that's generally what you're going to see. I'll get into brownfields a little bit, but there has also been some interest in using previously used lands, and there's certainly a few considerations with that. But for the most part, you will see these cited on agriculture. And this is also just to give you a better idea of, the different factors that come into play here and where the most interest would be is the Center for Rural PA put out a study where they kind of discussed a lot of different things, but one of the biggest things is where is solar most favorable? And this kind of takes into account various different factors, including access to transmission lines, cost of land, etc. Takes in all these factors that are important for solar developers and kind of highlights where the most likely hotspots will be for utility scale solar development. And as you can see here, again, in this western and central western part of PA, we certainly see a lot of potential here for utility scale solar. Now, as far as I know, there is only one utility scale solar site in use right now, um, kind of west of Erie. If you can see the red dot there at the edge of the border of PA near Erie, that's where it is. But there certainly have been projects that have moved through the process and gotten approved and are in the construction or pre-construction phase right now as far as utility scale here in Western PA. Now, I talked a little bit about brownfields. So there are some brownfields here in Western PA, though we don't have the bulk of them. I mean, the main source here in PA is definitely either reclaimed mineland or abandoned mineland that certainly can be used for solar siting, though it's not as much just because of the liability that exists with these projects, as well as the potential for a long reclamation process of kind of reclaiming these sites and bringing them up to what the levels of safety that they need to be, which that extra time can certainly cost a lot of money to solar developers that they might not have, as well as the extra construction concerns that developers need to take in. So it's certainly possible to develop on these sites, but it comes with a lot of complications, and there are, concerns, especially from community members, of increased runoff from the construction of sites that might have various contaminants. Something that can be managed, but it requires, some greater consideration. But generally speaking, that is certainly much more of a concern for central PA than it is here in western PA, and much more of an option. And we have seen a few developers, propose plans and move through the process towards developing, especially on abandoned minelands. So now to kind of get into what the state college has kind of seen with testing. So we have two sites ourselves at State College, solar sites that we use to kind of test okay, what are these runoff concerns? How likely are they? Can they be managed properly? And these sites are actually unique in that they are very unfavorable or fairly unfavorable. Um, Silty clay soils, and one site is about a 25% slope. The other site ranges from 5 to 30% slopes. So not ideal conditions, but we put different sensors to kind of tell what was going on in the soil. Was runoff and stormwater being produced, to kind of get a sense, could this be managed even in the worst conditions with best practices? So if you can see here, one site had, so generally speaking, panel spacing was about 3 meters, which was a very important factor. So we took in DEP's best practices for managing solar sites. They have an FAQ on it, made in 2021. That is a great resource for best practices. So one of the biggest thing is that 3 meter interspace that allows water to filter into the soil and kind of disconnects runoff from accumulating. That is one of the biggest things. These sites also use native and perennial grasses as ground cover, which have deeper roots, which allow for greater infiltration. And finally, because of just how the difficulty of the sites, and usually DEP recommends anything over 10 to 15% slopes would use other means of protecting against stormwater. So one site has 3 infiltration basins at the bottom, and another site has stormwater infiltration trenches along the contours as dictated by the stormwater ordinance on the other site. So those are important things to implement, but from all these practices that we implemented when we actually measured with our sensors, on one side it was on the center infiltration basin, did we see, excess water coming out, actually escaping the site? The answer was no. For the infiltration basin, on the first site, generally speaking, it was about a meter deep. And even at the largest rain event, which was 67.2 millimeters in a day, so think 2 millimeters short than the 24-hour, 2-year plan in place for the site. We saw maybe a tenth of the infiltration basin filled, so up to 110 millimeters out of a 1 meter depth. So we really didn't see any escape on that part. And the other site also didn't see any significant or any detected runoff escaping the infiltration basins from where it was sited on the edge of the site there. So generally speaking, it definitely can be managed. It is much more a matter of practices used. But obviously, anybody who's looked it up has seen in the past that, yeah, problems have occurred, which is why, again, this kind of regulation of it and making sure that best practices are followed is important. So the things that usually manage this is first, any kind of ground development will require an erosion and sediment control plan that would be reviewed by the county conservation districts. For any development over 1 acre, that would also require a permit from PADEP. For the National Pollutant Discharge and Elimination System permits, and that is for any development over 1 acre, which every large-scale solar site is going to be over. So they would all be subject to these regulations. And finally, some municipalities have stormwater ordinances. A certain amount are required to by Act 167. But as I said in our own site, then yeah, that is also a point of review on the local level for these projects. And we also kind of see an interesting thing in these stormwater ordinances, or it also will go into zoning when we see this specifically applied to solar, is that um, solar panels kind of it, are kind of in this place where they're considered maybe pervious surfaces or impervious surfaces, and it really depends on how the site itself is built. So when you look at these ordinances and how they actually operate, they will dictate how the solar panels arrays themselves will be viewed. And a lot of them will use language from or mirroring the PADP best practices, that if they follow these best practices, they can be considered a lesser form of impervious surface, maybe disconnected impervious area, and have an easier time receiving less extra measures in order to control stormwater if they can demonstrate that they are following these specific best practices. And I mentioned brownfields before. There are some concerns with that, but it is also a much more regulated area where there is a lot more permitting and reclamation efforts required to ensure that you aren't putting undue pollution into the environment. And finally, one of the biggest things that I think has caused some of these sites is, again, just the newness of the industry. 10, 20 years isn't that new for an industry. So kind of learning from past mistakes and trying to create solar specific guidance. So one of the great resources we have here is the PV Smart project that was funded by the DOE Solar Energy Technical Office. And that was this has been a very important towards this conversation of giving funding to the Great Plains Institute, University of Minnesota, and NREL in order to kind of look at a few solar sites and create modeling based off them, create some best practices to see what are the what are the greatest concerns and how can we create best practices and also model them so that the stormwater management practices that we use are solar specific and designed to make sure that we meet the challenge appropriately, don't overbuild stormwater controls, but also don't underbuild them and cause runoff concerns, flooding. So the biggest things that they found is compactation and bulk density are important. So avoiding compactation of the soil and keeping that bulk density to decent levels. Usually, depending on other factors, they recommend 1.1 grams per centimeter cubed to 1.5. But that is very important, and it involves making sure that avoiding heavy machinery only where it's necessary on site. Preceding the ground you're going to be operating on, or keeping whatever native vegetation you can on it. Reducing grading as much as possible, which has gotten a lot easier with advancements in pile driving technology that puts the poles in that the solar arrays stand on, as well as advancements in tracker technology, which is the device that's used to move solar panels to track the sun. Those originally had a very difficult time working on more uneven terrain, but recent advancements have created trackers that are more easily able to work on more uneven terrain, reducing the need for grading in those areas. Soil depth is something that you can't work around on itself generally, but by reducing the amount that you grade, not removing the topsoil or replacing the topsoil, which is a fairly common practice. And if you have a more shallow soil, making sure that other best practices are implemented to the full extent possible can be, needs to be done in order to offset that more shallow soil that can't take as much water in. Ground cover is another very important one. So as we used on our site, implementing more deep-rooted systems such as perennial grasses can make a huge difference in the ability to absorb more water. And one consideration that they have in their best practices that is important is that perennial grasses take a lot more time or take more time to establish. So in the meantime, using something like cover crops in that, you know, planting in order to hold the soil while you're establishing the perennial grasses is also an important thing to make sure that during the first year of the site, it isn't creating unnecessary runoff. And finally, that panel spacing, they'll recommend call it disconnection, and a general difference is we're measuring it from panel to panel, they're measuring it from pole to pole. So there might be some different numbers here involved. But from pole to pole, they're recommending generally what they see is 20 to 35 feet that they find to be most effective at effectively breaking up stormwater, allowing infiltration to occur. You know, most of the sites they've studied were able to get away with 25 feet, but it is going to depend on other factors on the site. And as I said before, along with their best practices, they've also developed a modeling software that can help regulators and solar developers adopt, kind of figure out exactly how they need to adapt their best practices to the site on hand and make it specific to solar development, which is important. And I know that our own team at Penn State is also working on creating their own modeling software for the same purpose. So there certainly is a lot, there's still some work to be done to make sure that we are protecting against the potential as much as possible, but that work is being done, and slowly but surely, this industry is getting better at addressing any concerns that there might be with stormwater. It's certainly possible with every type of development. It matters more how you do it than what you do, right? So, went a little over time, but yeah.
No, thank you, Matthew. And so you bring up some really good points in this, and we have about 5 minutes left before we conclude today's forum. You know, one of the things that popped into mind here is, you know, when you're creating these facilities, the presentation that happened prior to this was on data centers, and you know their requirements for both water and energy usage, electricity usage, and just the staggering amounts that they would need to power some of these facilities would just require, you know, square miles of solar panels to come close to generating that. Probably, you know, extents that are not even necessarily feasible at this point in time, especially in places where we don't have the land area available. You know, that being said, one thing that came to mind is when you're creating impervious surface area is, you know, we have atmospheric deposition of pollutants. You know, anytime you have, you know, combustion or you know, materials that are emitted from those processes, emissions, you know, they fall back down to earth, and that's either through precipitation or through like dry deposition on the surfaces. And if you don't have rain for, you know, say a week or two at a time, those will gather up on a surface. So any impervious surface will have this happen. But when you're introducing hundreds of acres, like 1,000 acres of impervious surface, you're also introducing that connection to where you might have the first flush of those pollutants off of that surface during a rain event. Have you looked into any of that, or know about some of those stats?
Yeah, I can't say that our researchers looked at that specifically. No, but I certainly would love to kind of talk with them and yeah, bring that up if that might be a concern there.
Amber, do we have any questions in the chat?
I don't see any coming up.
You know, another question I have, and that's certainly pertains less to the Lake Erie Basin, but an overall question about Pennsylvania in northwestern Pennsylvania, and central, we have a lot of abandoned mine lands, mostly surface mines in some of those areas. And you had mentioned kind of like that balance where it has to be, the proximity to, the transmission lines, the ability for, you to make that cost equation work between, construction and those considerations that go along with construction. When you're working on abandoned mine lands, there are a lot of those. But there might be that opportunity, and I'm sure it's been looked into. And if you know of it, let us know now. It's like, where you have creative projects where you might be matching up funds that are from the federal agencies on abandoned mine reclamation, and then the potential for incorporating solar and maybe even integrating wind into those areas that are conducive to it. Can you talk about like co-location of like different types of energy in the same place, and maybe how that relates to some of the abandoned mine lands?
Yeah, so we certainly see, I know that if a solar company partners potentially with other organizations, then maybe nonprofits in kind of reclaiming that land, then it is possible to kind of access some of those funds that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access on their own, from what I know of. But yeah, it's certainly, I know that some projects certainly have taken advantage of, some of the funds available out there through that way. There's also the 10% IRA adder. So on top of the 30% tax credit, there's an extra 10% towards developing on abandoned mine lands. So that is an important part of why we have seen that interest, is that there's the 10% adder on brownfields. There's also, most of these brownfields are sited within an energy community, which would pretty much be most of PA. Any community that either had some sort of coal site that's been closed down or a community adjacent to it is considered an energy community. So I don't have the map on me right now, but it's pretty much most of PA, and especially areas with these abandoned mine lands, that you can actually get an extra 10%. So in pretty much every case with a brownfield, you might be looking at 50% tax credit. So that is an important part. I know that the general statistics put the extra cost of what it takes to develop on these sites at about 10 to 15%. So that is an important factor too, is once you start kind of getting these extra incentives involved and extra income, that also generally affects, that overall economic analysis. Now, it definitely depends on site to site. There's some sites that may take years of reclamation in order to actually get them to a safe level. And one factor that is included in the cost when we talk about these things is just the cost of money, because these are, large projects. There's a lot of money behind them, and there's interest rates involved, there's returns involved. So the longer the project takes, especially when it's not making money, the longer, the less appealing taking extra years on the project to reclaim a site is going to be. So that's some of the challenges, as well as just the general liability that once you have a site, if it turns out that it's a lot worse than your first assessment is, you're legally still liable for the cleanup, given that you're the owner of the site, which can cause some concerns among developers.
Well, excellent, Matthew. Thank you for taking time out and teaching us a little bit more about solar facilities. And with that, I think that brings us to the end of the forum. So I'll turn it back over to Amber to close us out.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks, Tim. Thank you all for joining us for this wonderful Pennsylvania Lake Erie Environmental Forum. I encourage you to take our survey. I put the link in the chat for you to click on. It will also come to you in an email from Zoom, if that's how you signed up for this webinar, tomorrow. And save the date for the next LEAF meeting, which will be on April 22nd. With that, Tim, I think we are good to adjourn.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right, thanks all. Enjoy your day.